The camera was running, and there was nothing he could do to make it run faster. Hervey Stockman sat alone in a cockpit, barely wider than his shoulders, sealed inside a partial pressure suit, breathing bottled oxygen, 13 miles above the Western Soviet Union. It was the 4th of July, 1956. Below him, the land unrolled in shades of green and grey. Belorussia first, then the marshy approaches to Leningrad, and somewhere down there sat the airfields where the enemy was supposed to be building the bombers that would one day burn American cities. He carried no gun. At 70,000 feet, there was no such thing as a rescue. He had a single camera in the belly of the aircraft, a fuel gauge he watched the way a man watches his own pulse, and an order that reduced to one plain sentence: photograph the airfields and come home. The aircraft had no name that anyone was allowed to speak. On paper, it was called Article 347. In the air, it felt less like a machine and more like a held breath. The wings were so long and so thin that they flexed like a bird's, and the engine, starved of air, this high, could flame out if he pushed the throttle wrong. There was a narrow band of speed. He had to stay inside. Too slow and the wings would stop flying. Too fast and the airframe would tear itself apart. Pilots called that band the coffin corner, and Stockman had been living inside it for hours, holding the needle in a lane only a few knots wide, while the country that wanted him dead slid past underneath. He was over a nation that would treat his presence as an act of war. Soviet radar had found him almost as soon as he crossed the frontier. Far below, fighters were clawing upward, straining for an altitude their engines could not reach, stalling, falling back, trying again. He could not see them clearly. He could only picture them, a staircase of frustrated interceptors stacked beneath him, and he flew on, straight and level, because straight and level was what the camera needed. Every time the shutter cycled, it swallowed a strip of Soviet soil and locked away a piece of an answer that had been tearing Washington apart for a year. How many bombers did the Soviet Union really have? Not how many the newspapers said. Not how many the generals feared. How many were parked on the concrete right now where a lens could count them? Stockman did not know the answer. Nobody in the free world did. That was the entire point of the flight. And the answer, when the film came home and the analysts bent over it with their magnifiers, would be so strange, so quietly devastating, that it would take years for the country to understand what it had almost done to itself. Before we go any further, I want to ask you for something small. Cold War Impact is a small channel, and lately the numbers have been working against us. Views are down, and the reach that lets these documentaries find new people has narrowed. If you find this kind of deep, carefully researched history worth your time, the best thing you can do is subscribe, leave a comment, even a short one, and share the video with someone who loves this era. Every click tells the platform this work matters, and every share keeps the channel alive long enough to make the next one. Thank you. Now, let us go back to the fear that put Stockman in that cockpit. For most of a decade after the Second World War, the United States could not see inside the Soviet Union. That sounds like a small thing. It was not. It was the central terror of the early Cold War. A closed country the size of a continent had lowered an iron curtain, and behind it, the Soviets could build anything they wanted in any quantity they wanted, and the West would learn about it only when it was already pointed at them. American intelligence was reduced to scraps, a few refugees with fading memories, a few intercepted signals, photographs taken by travelers who happened to be near a railway with a camera, captured German maps from the war already going stale, rumors that hardened into estimates, and estimates that hardened into policy. In that darkness, fear did the work that facts could not, and fear is a poor draftsman. It always draws the enemy larger than life, and the thing they feared most had a shape and a name. It was the long-range bomber. In the early 1950s, there were no intercontinental missiles worth the name yet. If the Soviet Union wanted to strike the American homeland, it would have to fly there, and that meant heavy bombers with the range to cross the top of the world, drop a nuclear weapon on an American city, and turn for home. The United States had built exactly that kind of force. It was called Strategic Air Command, and under a hard-driving general named Curtis LeMay, it had become the most powerful instrument of destruction the planet had ever seen. Hundreds and then thousands of bombers kept on constant alert, engines warm, crews sleeping beside their aircraft. The men who ran that force understood better than anyone what it could do to a country. That was precisely why they lay awake at night. What if the Soviets were building the mirror image of it, only bigger, only faster, and America could not see it happening until the radar screens lit up? Then, in the summer of 1955, it seemed the nightmare had arrived. On the 3rd of July, at an airfield called Tushino, just outside Moscow, the Soviet Union held its annual aviation day. It was a show, a parade in the sky, and the Soviets used it the way they used the ground parades in Red Square, as a message to the men watching from the reviewing stand. Among those men were Western military attachés, the uniformed diplomats, whose entire job was to watch and count and report. More than 400 aircraft passed overhead that day. But the attachés forgot most of them the moment they saw the machine they had come to see. It was a huge, clean, 4-engine jet bomber, its wings swept sharply back, its engines buried in the roots of the wings the way the newest American designs buried theirs. The West already had a name waiting for it. They called it the Bison. Its real designation was the Myasishvalom M4, after the design bureau that built it, and until this afternoon, the West had caught only glimpses, a shadow at a rehearsal the year before, a paragraph in an aviation trade magazine warning that the Soviets were working on an intercontinental jet. Now here it was in the flesh, flying over the capital in formation. The attachés counted a first group of the giants. Then a second, larger group came through, and by the time the sky was empty, they believed they had seen close to 28 of these bombers in the air on a single afternoon. 28 may not sound like an army, but to a trained observer it screamed one word: production. You do not fly 28 examples of a brand new heavy bomber over your own capital, unless you have a factory line running hot, and many more of them where those came from. The attachés went back to their embassies and wrote it down, and the number crossed the Atlantic, and as it traveled, it grew. Here is where the story turns on something that almost nobody understood at the time and that most people still get wrong today. The bombers the West feared did not exist in anything close to the numbers the West believed. The fleet that would haunt American policy for years, that would reshape budgets and elections and the entire posture of the Cold War, was largely a thing of the imagination assembled not on Soviet runways but in American filing cabinets. And the tool that would finally prove this, that would let one unarmed man photograph the truth from the edge of space, was at that very moment being hand-built in secret in a walled-off corner of a California aircraft plant by a team sworn never to speak of it. The answer to the panic already existed. It simply had not yet been allowed to fly. To understand how a handful of aircraft over Moscow became a phantom armada over America, you have to follow the number as it moved through the machine that turns observation into policy. And you have to start with how badly wrong the experts had already been before Tushino ever happened. In January of 1954, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Arthur Radford, told a committee of Congress that the Soviets would not have a long-range jet bomber, not even a prototype, before 1958. That was the considered judgment of the highest-ranking military officer in the country. It was wrong within months. The prototype was already flying, and once the intelligence system realized it had missed the aircraft entirely, it overcorrected in the other direction with a vengeance. Because nothing frightens an analyst like being caught by surprise once, the estimates did not creep. They leapt. Follow the climb, because the climb is the whole tragedy in miniature. A special national estimate in the late summer of 1954 projected that the Soviets might have around 50 of the new heavy bombers by 1957 and 250 by 1959. The following summer, before the ink on that one was dry, a fresh estimate suggested the Soviet Union could field 600 heavy bombers of all types by the middle of 1958. Then came Tushino, and the sighting of those 28 Bisons poured fuels on the fire. Air Force intelligence took the 28, projected the assumed production rate forward, and concluded the Soviet Union would have at least 500 heavy bombers by the middle of 1960. The Central Intelligence Agency, working the same problem, produced a figure suggesting as many as 800 of the Bisons alone could be in service by that year. A formal estimate in the late summer of 1956 put current strength at a few dozen of each type and projected it toward 500 Bisons and 300 of the Bear by the early 1960s. As late as the winter of 1957, official estimates still had the Soviet heavy bomber force swelling toward 400 to 600 aircraft by the early part of the coming decade. Read those numbers again and notice what they have in common. Not one of them was a count. Every single one was a projection, a line drawn from a tiny scrap of evidence and extended confidently into a future nobody could see. The entire edifice rested on a sighting of 28 aircraft and an assumption about the factory behind them. And the assumption was false. There is a popular version of what happened at Tushino, and you have probably heard it. The story goes that the Soviets played a trick. They had only a small number of Bisons, so they flew the same aircraft past the reviewing stand, sent them out of sight, wheeled them around in a wide circle, and flew them past again, so that the same 10 machines were counted twice, or 3 times, or 6 times, inflating a tiny force into a fearsome one. It is a wonderful story, it is tidy, it is clever, and it lets everyone off the hook by making the Americans the victims of a magician rather than the authors of their own alarm. The trouble is that the historians who have gone back to the primary evidence do not think it happened that way, at least not as the neat conjuring trick it is usually described to be. The tail numbers painted on the aircraft would have betrayed the deception at once, because trained observers write those numbers down and the same machine passing twice would have carried the same number both times. More damning still, the British had their own attaché standing at that same air show watching the same bombers cross the same sky, and British intelligence walked away with an estimate roughly half the size of the American one. Same aircraft, same afternoon, 2 close allies, 2 wildly different conclusions. That single fact tells you where the real distortion happened. It was not a Soviet illusion in the air over Tushino. It was what the American system did with the sighting afterward, feeding a modest observation into an apparatus already primed by rivalry and by dread to expect the worst. The bomber gap, as it came to be called, was in large part something the United States did to itself. That distinction matters because it changes what kind of story this is. It is not a tale of Soviet cunning outfoxing American naivety. It is a tale of how a great and frightened power, deprived of its eyes, can talk itself into a threat, and how agonizingly hard it then becomes to talk itself back out again once the estimates are printed and the budgets are written and careers are staked on the danger being real. Now, turn the whole thing around and look at it from the other side, because the view from Moscow is stranger and sadder than the view from Washington. The Soviet Union did not possess a mighty bomber fleet. It possessed a serious problem, and the Bison was supposed to be the solution to it. The design bureau, led by Vladimir Myasishchev, had been handed a brutal assignment: build a jet bomber that could take off from Soviet soil, fly the enormous distance to the United States, deliver a nuclear weapon, and return. And they had failed at the hardest part of that sentence, the last word: return. The Bison was fast, and it was modern, and it looked genuinely magnificent in the air, but its thirsty early jet engines drank fuel far too quickly for the range required. It could reach the northern fringes of North America on a one-way trip, perhaps a mission from which the crew would not be coming back. It could not reliably strike the American heartland and fly home. And a bomber that cannot fly home is not a strategic deterrent. It is a single-use weapon, and no Air Force builds hundreds of those. So the machine that terrified the Americans was, to the men who built it, bitter disappointment. The Soviets knew it better than anyone because they had the engineering reports. That is the deep and painful irony sitting underneath this entire affair. At the very moment American generals were warning Congress that the Bison was about to bury them, Soviet engineers were quietly concluding that the Bison was a dead end and that the real future of long-range aviation lay elsewhere, in the great turboprop bomber the West called the Bear, which could actually make the distances, and, beyond even that, in rockets. Production of the Bison would be cut short. Only a fraction of the feared fleet would ever be built, and much of what was built would end up converted into aerial tankers, refueling other aircraft rather than menacing American cities. The Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, understood something crucial about the Western fear, though, and he was happy to feed it. He understood that the appearance of strength could be worth nearly as much as the real thing and cost a great deal less. A rival who believes you are 10 feet tall will treat you as though you are, and a convincing bluff is far cheaper than a genuine fleet. Whether or not any Soviet planner deliberately arranged for bombers to circle over Tushino, the Soviet state was perfectly content to stand back and let the West frighten itself, and Khrushchev would spend the next several years playing precisely the same hand with rockets he did not yet actually possess, boasting that his factories were turning out missiles like sausages, while the reality on the ground lagged far behind the boast. Meanwhile, on the American side, the fear had found powerful and sincere voices. This is important to understand, because it is tempting to imagine the alarm was cynical, cooked up to win money. It was not, or at least not mainly. The men driving it believed it. In 1956, Senator Stuart Symington, who had served as the very first Secretary of the Air Force, opened a series of hearings on American air power that laid out the danger in the bleakest possible terms. One senior airman after another came before the committee to warn that the Soviets were pulling ahead and that the free world was about to be eclipsed in the air. General LeMay of Strategic Air Command was among the most forceful of them. In testimony from that period, he argued that from 1958 onward, the Soviet Union would be the stronger power and that a stronger adversary might well conclude he ought to attack. To LeMay, this was not an abstract debate about numbers on a chart. He commanded the bombers that would have to fly the retaliation, and he was not about to be the man caught short when the sirens sounded. You can see how the whole apparatus fed on itself, turning in a closed circle. The Air Force feared a Soviet fleet, so it argued for more American bombers to match it. To justify more American bombers, it pointed to the feared Soviet fleet. The estimate justified the budget, and the budget requirement shaped the estimate, and the two leaned against each other like a pair of exhausted men holding one another upright. None of this made the participants liars. It made them human, and it made the situation genuinely dangerous, because the one thing that could break the circle was the one thing that no attaché, no refugee, and no intercepted message could provide. Hard evidence, a photograph, an honest count of the actual concrete at the actual bases. Getting that photograph was thought to be impossible, and the story of how it stopped being impossible begins not with a general, but with a group of civilian scientists and one very stubborn idea. If you cannot slip a spy into a sealed country, and you cannot fly an ordinary aircraft over it without being shot out of the sky, then you build an aircraft that flies so high nothing on Earth can reach it, hang the finest camera ever made in its belly, and simply fly over the secrets in broad daylight and photograph them at your leisure. The idea gathered force in 1954 when President Dwight Eisenhower himself, haunted by the memory of surprise attack, convened a panel of the nation's best technical minds to study how the United States might guard against being caught unaware. The panel was led by the president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, James Killian, and within it a smaller group on the problem of intelligence was driven by the brilliant inventor Edwin Land, the man who had given the world instant photography. It was Land, more than any general, who pressed the case for a dedicated high-altitude spy plane and pressed it directly onto the president. The Air Force had already looked at a radical design from Lockheed and turned it down as too flimsy and too strange. Land and his colleagues argued that its very strangeness was the point, and that the work should be handed not to the Air Force at all, but to the Central Intelligence Agency, kept quiet, kept civilian, kept deniable. Eisenhower approved it in November of 1954, and he approved it with his eyes open to exactly what it meant. He had commanded the invasion of Europe. He understood that sending an American military aircraft over the territory of a nation at peace was, by any honest reckoning, an act of war, and that if one of them ever came down, the wreckage and the pilot would prove the violation to the entire world. He worried about it constantly. He returned to that worry again and again over the years that followed. And he authorized the flights regardless, because the alternative, stumbling blind and terrified into the nuclear age, guessing at the enemy's strength and always guessing high, was worse than the risk of getting caught. The aircraft itself came from a small, secretive team at Lockheed run by a famously brilliant and famously impatient engineer named Clarence Johnson, whom everyone called Kelly. His group worked behind a partition in a corner of the plant, in a shop that earned the nickname the Skunk Works, and they designed and built the machine in roughly 8 months, a pace that for an aircraft, this radical was closer to sorcery than to engineering. What Johnson produced was less a warplane than a jet-powered glider, carrying a camera. He stripped away everything that did not help it climb. He gave it vast, fragile, drooping wings, a single engine and a fuselage so light and so thin-skinned that on the ground it had to be babied like blown glass, propped on outrigger wheels that fell away at takeoff. The result could climb above 70,000 feet and cruise there along the very ceiling of the breathable atmosphere. And at that height, in 1955 and 1956, nothing the Soviet Union possessed could touch it. Their best fighters ran out of air and stalled thousands of feet below it. Their surface-to-air missiles could not yet reach that high. The program was given the deliberately meaningless codename Aquatone, and the man the agency placed in charge of it was Richard Bissell, a driven cerebral economist turned spymaster who ran the whole enterprise with ferocious compartmented secrecy, funding much of it out of the agency's own contingency reserve so that not even the ordinary budget would betray its existence. The aircraft received a purposely boring designation to hide it among unremarkable utility planes. It was called the U-2. The test pilot Tony Livier lifted the first one off a dry lake bed in the Nevada desert on the 1st of August 1955, less than a month after the Ticino flypast that had lit the whole panic. Flying it was its own ordeal, a physiological experiment as much as an aeronautical one. At 70,000 feet, a man's blood will boil if his cabin fails, so the pilots wore partial pressure suits and breathed pure oxygen for hours before takeoff to purge the nitrogen from their bodies and avoid the crippling pain that deep-sea divers called the bends. The aircraft needed a special fuel, a heavy, low-volatility kerosene formulated, so that it would not simply boil away into the near vacuum at altitude. The margins were merciless, everywhere you looked. And yet, the machine worked, and it opened a door that had been sealed since the day the Iron Curtain fell. But before that door swung fully open, the United States tried other ways through the wall, and the failures are worth remembering, because they showed just how hard the problem was and how much was riding on the U-2, succeeding where everything else had come up short. There had been overflights before, desperate and dangerous ones. As far back as 1952, under President Truman, a specially modified American jet bomber had made a deep dash across Soviet Siberia and lived to tell of it, but such flights were rare, terrifying gambles, and more than one reconnaissance crew probing the Soviet frontier in those years was shot down and lost with all aboard. Vanishing into a silence the government could never publicly explain. You could not build an intelligence picture of a continent one suicidal sortie at a time. Then there were the balloons. Under a program called Genetrix, the United States built hundreds of camera-carrying balloons and turned them loose into the high winds that stream from west to east. Across the northern half of the globe, Eisenhower authorized the effort late in December of 1955, and the first balloons rose in January of 1956, launched from sites in Scotland, in Norway, in West Germany, in Turkey, each one set adrift to ride the jet stream clear across the Soviet Union and be snatched out of the sky again over the Pacific. It was ingenious, and in practice it was close to hopeless. The winds refused to cooperate. Balloons wandered off course, came down in the wrong places, or simply disappeared. The Soviets shot great numbers of them out of their sky and gleefully put the recovered cameras on public display as proof of American trespass. Of the hundreds launched, only a small fraction ever came back with anything worth studying, and what they brought back was scattered and random. The balloons proved you could photograph Soviet territory from above. They could not prove you could photograph the particular things you needed to see at the particular moment you needed to see them. Under a storm of Soviet protest, the program was shut down within weeks of beginning. And then there was the boldest gamble of all, an operation of almost reckless nerve called Home Run. In the spring of 1956, Strategic Air Command under LeMay flew converted reconnaissance bombers again and again across the top of the Soviet Union from a base at Thule in the far north of Greenland, mapping the Arctic frontier that Soviet bombers would have to cross on their way to America and listening to the Soviet radar network as it lit up to track them. Over roughly 7 weeks, from late March into May, these aircraft flew scores of penetrations along and across the Soviet coast. The operation reached its climax with a mass daylight flight of several reconnaissance aircraft driving straight across a stretch of Soviet territory in broad daylight, an act so brazen that LeMay is said to have remarked afterward that with a few more crews he might have started the Third World War right there. When Moscow protested, Washington blandly blamed navigation errors and severe weather. Home Run was audacious, and it gathered real and valuable intelligence about the northern approaches and the radar defenses. But it, too, could not answer the central question, because it skirted the edges of the country. It could not fly deep over the heartland where the bomber bases actually sat, since to do that with those aircraft, at those altitudes, over those defenses, would have been to throw the crews away. That was the wall. Every approach smashed against, the lone bombers could not survive in numbers. The balloons could not aim, the Arctic flights could not go deep. The truth about the Soviet bomber force lay on airfields far inside the country, and the only way on Earth to counter what was parked on them was to fly directly over those fields with a camera and get away clean. Which brings the story back to the U-2 and to the 10 days in the summer of 1956 that finally ended the argument that estimates alone could never settle. By the middle of that summer, the aircraft was ready, the pilots were trained, and a small detachment had been slipped quietly onto an airbase at Wiesbaden in West Germany, hidden in plain sight under a thin cover story about high-altitude weather research. Now the decision came to rest on Eisenhower personally, and it was an agonizing one that he did not delegate. Every single flight was a calculated wager with the peace of the world. The president knew the Soviets would detect the aircraft on their radar the moment it crossed the line. He was betting two things at once. First, that they would not be able to shoot it down. Second, that even as they raged in private, they would say very little in public. Because to announce that American aircraft were sailing serenely over Moscow and they could do nothing about it would be a humiliation the Kremlin could not stomach. He rationed the flights carefully, he insisted on personally approving the most sensitive routes, and he lived in genuine dread of the morning when one of them would fail to return. But he let them go one at a time, because the film they carried home was worth more than any other intelligence the country could obtain by any other means. Understand what that camera could do, because it is the beating heart of why the whole mission worked. Kelly Johnson's team, working hand in hand with the finest optical scientists in the country, men who ground lenses to tolerances measured in millionths of an inch, had produced a camera that could photograph the ground from 13 miles up and resolve objects only a couple of feet across. From the very edge of space, it could show you not merely that an airfield existed, but exactly what sat upon it. How many aircraft, of precisely which type, arranged in what pattern, right down to details a trained analyst could measure with a ruler laid on the developed print. A single pass could photograph a ribbon of the Soviet Union dozens of miles wide and hundreds of miles long. Where a spy on the ground might catch a fleeting glimpse of one base and then guess wildly at all the rest, the U-2 could lay an entire bomber complex out flat on a light table back home and let the interpreters simply count heads. For the first time in the history of the Cold War, the question of how many bombers the Soviets had was about to stop being a matter of fear and become a matter of arithmetic. Those interpreters mattered as much as the pilots, though almost no one has ever heard their names. A quiet, methodical specialist named Arthur Lundell built and led the small band of photo interpreters who would turn miles of exposed film into hard intelligence, and in doing so, he all but founded a discipline. These were the people who would bend over the light tables for hours, with loupes pressed to their eyes, distinguishing a bomber from a transport by the shape of a wing, a real aircraft from a wooden decoy by the shadow it cast. And it was their patient, unglamorous counting that would finally give the argument an answer that no general could shout down. Their craft was closer to detective work than to photography. From the length of a runway, they could judge what class of aircraft it was built to carry. From the pattern of fuel storage and the scarring of engine test stands, they could read whether a base was truly operational or merely a shell. A decoy might fool the eye from the ground, but it could not fake the oil stains, the tire tracks, the worn taxi paths, and the servicing clutter that surround a genuinely active aircraft, and the interpreters learned to look for the wear rather than the machine. It was this discipline, painstaking and almost invisible, that turned a roll of exposed film into a verdict a president could act upon. The campaign opened on the 20th of June 1956 when a pilot named Carl Overstreet flew the first operational mission over hostile ground, crossing Poland and East Germany. Nothing rose to meet him. The aircraft performed exactly as promised, and it came home with its film intact. That success gave the planners the nerve for the missions that truly mattered, and on the 4th of July, American Independence Day, Hervey Stockman climbed away from Wiesbaden in Article 347 and turned east across the frontier into the Soviet Union itself, the first man ever to overfly that country in the U-2. His long route carried him across Belorussia and up toward Leningrad, over naval shipyards and airfields, a flight lasting nearly 9 hours in that cramped, freezing cockpit, and he brought his film home. The very next day, the 5th of July, a pilot named Carmine Vito flew the mission that no man would ever repeat. He flew directly over Moscow. He photographed the very aircraft factory at Philly, where the Bison bombers were assembled, along with the test airfields and the plants scattered around the Soviet capital. An American aircraft had flown across the enemy's own capital city in full daylight, photographed his most secret works, and returned in time for a late breakfast. Over roughly 10 days that summer, the little detachment flew a handful of these deep penetrations, 5 of them over the Soviet Union proper. And then the film went to Lundahl's interpreters, and they bent over the light tables, and quietly, without a shot fired, the shape of the Cold War changed. They were hunting for bombers. Specifically, they were hunting for the Bison, the machine that had launched 1,000 budget requests and 100 alarming headlines on the long-range bomber bases where a fleet of 500 or 800 aircraft would have to be parked, serviced, fueled, and flown. The July photographs covered 9 of those bases. The interpreters worked across them one at a time, base by base, hardstand by hardstand, aircraft by aircraft, counting with the cold patience the work demanded. There were no Bisons. Not a reduced number of them. Not a merely worrying number. None. At the 9 long-range bomber bases the July missions photographed, the great fleet that American intelligence had confidently projected was simply, flatly, not there. The concrete that was supposed to be crowded wingtip to wingtip with the machines that would incinerate American cities held other aircraft, older types, ordinary traffic, empty aprons. The interpreters checked and rechecked because a finding like that carries its own kind of terror. To walk into a room and tell the President and the Joint Chiefs and eventually the Congress that the enemy fleet everyone had been budgeting against did not exist, you had better be absolutely certain. And the camera let them be certain in a way that no attaché squinting up a Touche-No with a notebook ever could have been. It is worth pausing on how rare and how difficult the thing they had just accomplished truly was. It is one matter to find a weapon. It is a far harder matter to prove that a weapon is not there, to prove a negative stretched across an entire continent, because an absence can always be explained away by a frightened mind. Perhaps the bombers were at other bases. Perhaps they had been dispersed, or hidden, or flown away the day before. But the U-2 kept flying in the months and the years that followed, base after base, region after region, dragging its cameras across the length and breadth of the Soviet Union, and the answer kept coming back the same. The mass fleet of Bisons that had been forecast never turned up on the ground, for the simple and stubborn reason that it had never been built. The fear had been entirely real. The bombers had not. There was tension even in the victory because the Soviets had seen the whole thing. Their radar had tracked the intruder from the first minutes over the frontier. Their fighters had clawed and strained and failed to reach its altitude, wallowing helplessly in the thin air far below and sliding back toward the earth. The Soviet leadership was privately incandescent and publicly mute, exactly as Eisenhower had gambled they would be. Moscow lodged a secret diplomatic protest through quiet channels, refusing to admit in the open that its skies had been violated at will. And Eisenhower, deeply unsettled that the flights had been detected so cleanly and tracked so completely, tightened his personal grip on every future mission. But the essential bet had paid off in full. The aircraft that could not be touched had flown over the enemy's very heart and carried home the truth. That truth traveled fast inside the government, even as it was buried from the public. The director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Alan Dulles, studied the photographs of the empty bomber bases and pronounced them worth $1 million apiece. Richard Bissell would say later that within a couple of years, the great majority of all the hard intelligence the United States possessed about the Soviet Union was flowing in through the lens of that single camera. And the effect on policy was immediate and concrete. When the Air Force pressed, as it kept pressing, for still more heavy bombers to close the supposed gap, the White House now held in its hands something no one had ever held before. In this argument, proof. Eisenhower could look at the demand for a crash buildup and know, from photographs he was not permitted to show to the very men making the demand, that the emergency was hollow. The bomber gap, as a real and measurable military fact, died on those light tables in the summer of 1956. And yet, it did not die in public, and that is among the strangest twists in the entire affair. The source was too precious to reveal. If the United States announced to the world that it knew the Soviet bomber fleet was small, it would be announcing in the same breath that it was flying over the Soviet Union whenever it pleased, and that admission would force the very confrontation everyone was desperate to avoid and might slam shut the priceless window the U-2 had pried open. So the government began, quietly and without ever explaining why, to lower its published estimates of Soviet bomber strength. Late in 1956, the agency started feeding smaller numbers into the system, and the members of Congress, who knew nothing of the U-2, were left to puzzle over the change in the dark. Some suspected that the earlier alarm had been deliberately inflated all along to pry loose money for the Air Force. Others suspected the exact opposite, that the reassuring new numbers were being quietly shaved down on White House orders to hold federal spending in check. Both camps were arguing furiously in the dark over figures that had, in cold fact, already been settled beyond dispute by a camera that not one of them was cleared to know existed. And here, the fear performed its cruelest trick of all. It did not go away, it merely changed its costume. Even as the bomber gap quietly collapsed inside the intelligence community, the Soviet Union tested the world's first true intercontinental ballistic missile and then, in October of 1957, hurled the little satellite Sputnik into orbit atop a rocket that could just as easily have carried a warhead to an American city. The same machinery of anxiety that had manufactured the bomber gap now went to work manufacturing a missile gap, the conviction that the Soviets were racing ahead in rockets exactly as they had supposedly raced ahead in bombers. The estimates began to climb all over again along the same fevered curve. And once again, the eventual truth would prove far smaller than the fear, and once again it would take reconnaissance from the edge of space, first the U-2 and then the photographic satellites that soon followed it, to prove it. The country had mastered the technical lesson, how to see. It had not yet learned the far harder human lesson, how to stop being afraid of the things it could not yet see. Now come the plain numbers, because the reckoning is where this story stops being a spy thriller and hardens into a warning. Hold the projections in your mind: 500 heavy bombers by 1960, perhaps 800 Bisons. Estimates that had the Soviet fleet doubling and tripling year upon year, marching inexorably toward supremacy. Now, set them beside what the Soviet Union actually built. Across the entire production run of the Bison, which ended in 1963, the Soviets manufactured only about 93 of the aircraft. Not 800, not 500, around 93 in total, ever. At no point did the entire Soviet long-range heavy bomber force, of every type combined, number much more than roughly 150 aircraft. The turboprop Bear was built in somewhat larger numbers, and because unlike the short-legged Bison, it could actually fly the required distances, it endured, which is why upgraded versions of it are still in the air today. But the vast jet armada that had reshaped American politics, redirected billions of dollars, and colored 2 elections, had a true strength at the bases where it was supposed to live of essentially nothing. Now, look hard at what the fear had built on the American side of the ledger. Convinced it was falling behind, the United States poured its treasure into bombers, producing more than 2,000 of its B-47 medium jets and approaching 750 of the enormous B-52 heavy bombers, until its strategic bomber force swelled past 2,500 aircraft at its peak. The country had sprinted at absolute full speed to catch a rival who was barely walking. This is not to say the American buildup was pointless, for the force it created anchored deterrence and arguably kept the peace for decades afterward. But the specific panic that drove so much of it, the bomber gap, the frantic belief that the Soviets held a dangerous lead that had to be matched right now, at any cost, was built from top to bottom on a threat that the photographs proved to be a phantom. Whatever gap existed ran the other way, hugely, overwhelmingly in America's favor, and it did so the entire time the country was terrifying itself about the reverse. The men who proved all this received very little for it, and some of them received nothing at all. The pilots who flew those first missions over the Soviet Union did so alone and unarmed, riding the razor's edge of what any aircraft could physically do, knowing with certainty that if they went down, they would be disowned, that their government would deny them, that there would be no rescue and quite possibly no acknowledgement that they had ever existed. For years they could tell no one, not their friends, not their families, what they had done. Heavy stockmen who flew that very first flight into the Soviet Union on Independence Day went on to other cockpits and other wars, and years later, flying reconnaissance in the skies over Vietnam, he was shot down and spent more than 5 years as a prisoner of war before coming home. And still, the record of that July morning over Leningrad stayed locked away in the vaults for decades. Richard Bissell, the driving intelligence behind the whole program, is remembered by history at least as much for a later operation of his that failed catastrophically as for the quiet, complete triumph of the U-2. The interpreters who counted the empty concrete, who found the courage to write down in an official report that the great feared fleet was simply not there, are very nearly anonymous to this day. Their reward was that their country did not bankrupt itself or panic itself into a war over bombers that did not exist. It is the purest kind of victory there is, the kind that leaves behind no monument and no medal, because its proof is an absence, and you cannot photograph or memorialize a catastrophe that never came. For a long time, the country did not even know this victory had been won. The full story stayed sealed for a generation. The photographs, the flights, the very existence of the program that had settled the bomber gap remained among the most closely guarded secrets in Washington, and the official history of the aircraft and its early missions would not be declassified and released for the public to read until decades had passed. When historians were at last allowed to lay the records side by side, the estimates against the imagery, the projections against the count, the shape of the whole self-inflicted panic became clear in a way it never could have been to the frightened public living through it. The men who had shouted the loudest about the gap had been sincere. They had also been almost entirely wrong, and the proof of how wrong had been sitting in a vault the whole time, waiting for the secrecy to lift. And the program that had banished one nightmare eventually walked straight into the other one that Eisenhower had feared from the very first day. For 4 years, the U-2 flew over the Soviet Union with something close to impunity, and every year the Soviets worked feverishly to build a missile that could reach it. On the 1st of May, 1960, they finally succeeded. A pilot named Francis Gary Powers, flying a mission deep across the country from a base in Pakistan toward a landing in Norway, was knocked out of the sky near the city of Sverdlovsk by a salvo of the new Soviet surface-to-air missiles. He survived, bailed out, and was captured, and with him, the Soviets recovered the unmistakable wreckage of the aircraft, the cameras, and the film. Everything Eisenhower had dreaded came true at once. Khrushchev sprang the trap with relish, letting the Americans issue a cover story about a stray weather plane before triumphantly producing the living pilot and the damning debris. A summit meeting between the two leaders in Paris, only days away, collapsed in acrimony. The overflights of the Soviet Union ended that day for good. Powers was tried in Moscow, convicted, and imprisoned. And in February of 1962, he was exchanged for a captured Soviet spy on a bridge between East and West Berlin. But by the time the U-2 was finally driven from Soviet skies, it had already handed its torch to a successor that no missile could ever reach. Later that same year, 1960, an American reconnaissance satellite returned its first cargo of usable film from orbit hundreds of miles up, utterly beyond the reach of any interceptor or any missile. The eye that the U-2 had opened over the Soviet Union would never close again. It had merely climbed higher into space, where it remains to this day. There is a single line that captures the whole strange affair, and, fittingly, it comes from the other side, from Sergei Khrushchev, the son of the Soviet leader who watched these years unfold from inside the Kremlin itself. Speaking long afterward about the bombers that had so thoroughly frightened the West, he described how pitifully few of them there truly were, only a handful crossing the sky above the crowd that day, and how the belief in a vast fleet had grown up around that handful, the way a legend grows around a campfire. That belief, he said plainly, was a myth, and it was the U-2, he said, that destroyed it. Sit with that for a moment. The single most feared air fleet on the face of the earth was, to a very large degree, a frightening story that a great nation told itself in the dark. And it took one camera, flown 13 miles above the truth by one silent man, to switch on the light and reveal an empty room. That is the real and lasting lesson of the bomber gap, and in the end it has almost nothing to do with aircraft. It is about what happens to a powerful and frightened nation when it is stripped of its sight, forced to guess, and left to fill the surrounding silence with monsters conjured half from the enemy's ambition and half from its own. The Soviets, in the end, barely had to lift a finger. The fear manufactured its own evidence and then believed it. And the cure, when it finally came, was not a better bomber, or a bigger budget, or a louder general. It was information. Cold, specific, countable information. The simple, world-altering difference between how many of a thing you imagine and how many are actually sitting out there on the ramp in the morning light. That difference did not stay locked in the 1950s. It is back on the front page in our own time, and the machines at the center of it are astonishingly the direct descendants of the very aircraft that began this story. The Bear bomber that the West first glimpsed with such alarm over Tushino in 1955 is still in frontline service with the Russian Air Force in the 2020s, more than 70 years on, re-engined and re-equipped, but recognizably the same great turboprop, still flying the long, Doppler probing patrols toward the edges of Western airspace that send fighters scrambling up to escort it. Alongside it, Russia flies the enormous Swing-Wing Blackjack, the largest combat aircraft ever built, and the Backfire, and together these three Cold War designs still carry the cruise missiles that Russia has fired into Ukraine. And the old problem, the gap between what a fleet appears to be and what it truly is, has come back, along with the aircraft. Russia announced years ago that it would build 50 modernized examples of the Blackjack, a proud new production line to renew its long-range reach. A decade later, that line had managed to deliver only a tiny handful of new aircraft, and the entire Blackjack fleet still numbers only around 15. The promise was enormous. The reality on the concrete was small. If that pattern sounds familiar by now, it should. It is the very same distance between the announcement and the airfield that the U-2 was invented to measure. And then, on the 1st of June, 2025, that distance was measured again in the most violent fashion imaginable. In an operation Ukraine named Spiderweb, its security service smuggled swarms of small first-person view drones deep into the interior of Russia, concealed inside the roofs of ordinary cargo trucks, and parked those trucks near several of Russia's strategic bomber bases, thousands of miles from the front line. At places whose names run from Belaya out in Siberia to Alenia up in the far north, on command the truck roofs slid open and the drones rose and flew into the parked bombers. Ukraine launched more than 100 of the drones and claimed that dozens of Russia's irreplaceable strategic bombers were struck, putting the damage in the billions of dollars and asserting it had knocked out a large slice of Russia's missile-carrying fleet in a single afternoon. Independent analysts, poring over satellite images in precisely the way Arthur Lundahl's interpreters once pored over their rolls of U-2 film, judged the confirmed losses to be lower than the Ukrainian claims, with a smaller number of bombers verifiably destroyed. The exact count is argued over still, and honest accounts give a range rather than a single tidy figure. But the essential fact is beyond dispute. Aircraft that Russia can no longer build, the last surviving giants of the Cold War, were burning on their own runways deep inside their own country, and the world learned how many, and which ones, in the identical way it once learned the truth about the Bisons, by photographing the concrete from above and counting what was, and what was not, actually there. The tools have changed almost past recognition. Where Eisenhower once agonized for days over whether to send a single unarmed man in a fragile glider to bring home one roll of film. The truth about any airfield on Earth can today be purchased from a commercial satellite by anyone with a laptop and a little money and refreshed within hours. Where Lundell's interpreters once worked in such total secrecy that Congress itself could not be told the source of their findings. The imagery of the spiderweb strikes was circling the open internet within a day. The darkness that made the bomber gap possible in the first place has very largely lifted, and yet the deeper trap has not sprung shut at all. Not even slightly, because the hard part was never taking the picture. The hard part, from that summer in 1956 down to this very morning, was believing the picture over the roar of all the people who needed the threat to be larger than the film said it was. So the next time you hear, in our own anxious age, a confident claim about how many of some fearsome thing a rifle power possesses, about fleets and arsenals and forces supposedly massing just beyond the edge of the map, hold in your mind those 9 airfields photographed on an American Independence Day nearly 70 years ago. And the answer the camera carried home from them. Not a smaller fleet than feared. No fleet at all, exactly where the largest one on Earth was supposed to stand. A nation crossed into the jet age, carrying a bomber that could strike its enemy but never fly home. An arrival on the far side of the world talked itself so thoroughly into treating that failure as a mortal danger that it nearly reshaped its entire future around a shadow. One aircraft, one camera, one pilot, forbidden for decades to say a word about it, took that shadow apart from 13 miles up. The line between the enemy you imagine and the enemy who is truly there has never once stopped being the most consequential line in the world. And it is still, this very day, drawn by whoever is willing to climb above the fear and count what is actually below.